Okay, so everything that you have been doing over the last few lessons is leading up to this. This is the culmination of frequency now. And we're going to look over the next two lessons at cumulative frequency graphs. And there's a fair bit that you can do and learn from a cumulative frequency graph. So, first of all, if you just have a look at the table, you can see that in the table we have the marks of some students, a frequency, and then we've got a column for cumulative frequency as well. So I just want you to pause the video quickly and see if you can think of what the upper boundaries for each group would be. And then just have a look at that cumulative frequency. Now this is something that you should have looked at before in GCSE. And so it's something that you should know how to do, but just have a check of those values and make sure that you are happy with it and you do know what it is that you're doing with cumulative frequency. Otherwise, it would be something to very quickly look up in the textbook or online and just check that you know how to do cumulative frequency. Okay, so let's have a look then, those upper boundaries. So the upper boundaries, as we said before, are the average of the upper boundary of this class with the lower boundary of this class. And in this case, because there is 1 unit difference between them, the upper boundary ends up with a 0.5. So this upper boundary is 10.5 here. Okay. When we come to draw our cumulative frequency graph, the upper boundaries are going to form the x-axis, the horizontal axis of the graph. The cumulative frequency, the definition of cumulative frequency is the sum of all the frequencies up to and including that new value. So here, the cumulative frequency is 2 because we've only had 2 people so far. Just 2 people getting between 1 and 10. By the time we look at marks from 11 to 20, the cumulative frequency is 7 because 5 more people have been added in. So we've got 2 plus 5 makes 7. As we go through here, we have 9 people in this class, and we add that to the 2 and the 5 from before, and we get 16, and so on all the way down to the bottom. By the time you get to the last class here, the cumulative frequency for this one should tell you the total number of people who took part in that survey, or in this case took part in the test. So 70 people took part in this test. Okay, so the cumulative frequency is quite useful. So we're now going to use the upper boundaries and the cumulative frequency to draw a graph of this data. So I'd like you to pause the video here and draw that graph. Before I move on, I'd like you to draw the graph by yourself. It needs to be completed with a nice smooth curve going through the data points before you move on to the next section. Okay, so you should have a graph that looks a little bit like this in front of you. Okay, and we're just going to look at these and how we calculate the median, the lower quartile and the upper quartile from these kind of graphs. Now, we talked about the median from grouped frequency data before, okay? And we looked at the median as being n plus 1 divided by 2. When we're talking about n here, it's the number of individual data points, or the highest number on the cumulative frequency graph. So you can go up to the top here, and you can see you've got this number there. If you go across, the highest number is 70, as we saw on the table before. So in this case, I do 70 plus 1 divided by 2. That does not give me the median value. That number tells me the median position, okay? So that number does not tell me my 35.5, because that's 70 plus 1 divided by 2. that number gives me my median position. The lower quartile is n plus 1 divided by 4, and the upper quartile is 3 times n plus 1 divided by 4. And again, these values just give me the position, and I'm going to show you what I mean by the position in a second. Okay. So the lower half of my data, or the number which sits directly in the middle of the lower half of my data, is the lower quartile, Q1. The number that sits in the middle of the upper half of my data is the upper quartile, and that there should read Q3, not Q2. Okay, so do be careful when you're using the Qs. This one here should be a Q3 and not a Q2. So this is what I mean. Let's take a look at this median position. So my total number on the graph was 70. I added 1 to it and I divided by 2, and that gave me a median position of 35.5. Okay, so then I go up here and I look along my cumulative frequency axis for around about 35.5, so about here. Okay, and then I follow that line across, following it across like this until it reaches my graph line. I then follow it down to the bottom axis, and it will tell me which mark is the median mark. I do exactly the same with my lower quartile and my upper quartile. Okay, so I find that my lower quartile, the mark for that is 32.5, and the mark for my upper quartile is 51. So do be careful. When you've worked these out, you have not worked out the median lower quartile and upper quartile. What you've worked out is the position, and you need to read the values then from the graph. Otherwise, there'd be no point in having that graph there. Obviously then, you can also work out the interquartile range. So you could go back here and you could look at your upper quartile, which is 51, and your lower quartile, which is 32.5, and you could subtract 32.5 from 51 and get 18.5. Okay. You can also work out probabilities, and this is really quite useful. So, for example, in this case, maybe I say, what is the probability that a student chosen at random? So I line up all these 70 students, and I'm just going to pick one at random. What is the probability that I pick someone who had a mark less than or equal to 30? So I find 30 on the marks axis here, and I draw a line upwards this time, and then I draw a line across, and it hits around about 16. Okay, and then I put that as a fraction of the total. So 16 out of 70, and then you can simplify that to 8 out of 35. And that gives me a probability. So I've got an 8 in 35 chance of picking someone with a mark less than or equal to 30. They might also ask you questions about percentiles. So if you're the fourth tallest person in a group of 20, so here's the group of 20 here, and you are the fourth tallest person, 80% of the people in that group are shorter than you. So that means that you are at the 80th percentile. Okay, so your height, 1.85 metres in this case, is the 80th percentile. And you can calculate a percentile by doing P. So if you wanted to find out, for example, the 75th percentile, you'd put 75 in here, multiplied by the total number of values you had. So from that last example, that would be 70 plus 1, and then divide it by 100. So if they ask you about a percentile, if they give you the value, for instance, if they ask you for the 80th percentile, you'd put in 80 instead of P. If they ask you for the 10th percentile, you'd put in 10 instead of P. And you'll get the value that is the 10th or the 80th or the 75th percentile of your data. Okay, over to you then. Page 65, exercise 2i. Give it a go, see how you get on.